So today I'm going to be focusing on a key passage from Epictetus. And even if you're new to Stoicism, you're probably quite familiar with it. It is going over the famous dichotomy of control. And in in the Enchiridion of Epictetus, toward the very end of the very first section, he goes over how to actually apply the dichotomy of control in your life. And so this is the quote up here, but I'll just step through it quickly. So overall, it starts with a disagreeable impression, which is essentially a first impression about things that doesn't feel good, essentially getting upset about something. Epictetus then suggests to us that we take a moment and pause to examine the underlying assumptions about the impression and examine it by a lot of quote unquote rules that we possess. And among those is the biggest rule of all, the dichotomy of control, whether it's in your control or within your power, or not within your control, or not within your power. And if it's not within your power, Epictetus tells us to do a very specific thing. He tells us to be ready with the phrase, "That's nothing to me." So the question is, what does this, have you ever stopped to kind of think about what this phrase, "That's nothing to me," actually means? So maybe not, because it seems pretty obvious on its face. There are a lot of ways to translate it, but essentially it comes down to it doesn't matter, or putting it to one side. And so maybe you haven't stopped to ask the question about what "that's nothing to me" actually means, because it's pretty straightforward. And we say this kind of thing all the time. Oh, that's nothing, or even in other languages as a kind of response to thank you, and, de nada, it's nothing. So this is a pretty common phrase, and there's not much reason on its face to question it. And it actually fits quite well in a lot of circumstances. If you want to be more effective, for instance, say going to the gym, you can't necessarily control the outcomes. You can't control the gains directly. You can't just turn up a knob and increase your strength. Instead, progress comes from consistently showing up and training smartly. So that is what is in your control. And if the results are outside of your control and you're struggling, as they're going to be ups and downs, you can just say "that's nothing to me" to it. And it makes a lot of sense to do that. And also in business, whether it's funding rounds, the results of those are not directly in your control, or something like business owners, especially restaurant owners in the pandemic nowadays. Sometimes you can't control the outcomes of what's going on, but the best you can do is to focus on what's in your control, and you actually become a lot more efficient by doing that. But Stoicism's not really all about efficiency, and I'm glad to see my previous colleagues bring that up in a lot of their talks. It's also a lot about dealing with struggles in life, as well as becoming a better person overall. And so these struggles can range from simple things such as commuting to interpersonal conflicts. You can't necessarily control what other people do, say, or think, but you can try to control your response and reactions to them. And also it could come up in other examples, like, for instance, I guess this guy looks like he's a hedge fund manager or something. He's sneaking out to play some Among Us, and he got air vented on the first go. Like, that's very frustrating. I mean, he left his job and is playing a video game and loses on the first try. So "that's nothing to me" can work out. But more seriously, it can also help with a lot of serious struggles that occur in daily life. And so "that's nothing to me," interpreted as putting things to the side or not caring about them as much, does some work, but it's also not always a good fit. So Stoicism does help a lot of people with illnesses, and I don't want to diminish that, but often it seems like a less of a good fit if somebody you love is seriously ill. If the person in your bed was your daughter or mother, try this on for size. If somebody told you that your mother, daughter, or family member, or some other person you love is seriously ill, say to yourself, "it's nothing to me." Does it seem like a good fit? It also seems like less of a good fit for global tragedies, such as what happened on the killing fields of Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge. 1 in 8 people in Cambodia were killed often after going through extraordinary hardship. So is this saying "it's nothing to me" when something is outside of your control historically, does that really make for a good fit? Or what about when that history is affecting the lives of many people today? If you are in an affected group that's affected by systematic racism, and you come across Stoicism and you read Epictetus's words saying "it's nothing to me," it's kind of sounding like passivity almost. Is this the thing that Epictetus really wanted to get across, to say it's nothing to me, to struggle and oppression? Or if you're outside a group that's affected, does Stoicism then give you the license to say, it's outside of my control, it's nothing to me? I don't think so. And so this doesn't seem like a good fit either. And finally, what about global poverty? 1 in 10 people have trouble clothing, sheltering, or feeding themselves within the world. And even if the most good-hearted among us decided to sell all our possessions and effectively get it to people in dire need, we'd barely make a drop in the ocean. So it's not within our control. But is it therefore nothing to me? Does it therefore mean it doesn't matter? From disease to global conflict to systematic racism to global poverty, are these things really nothing to us in the way that it seems to be on its face? Is this what Epictetus is really telling us? Because if it is, it's painting a pretty strange and quite frankly repugnant view of the ideal for Stoicism, to kind of just sit there while the world burns around you. Whether it affects you, it's nothing to me, I can't control it anyway. Or whether it's affecting others, it's nothing to me again. But we know from history that the historical Stoics were not like this. They didn't sit around and just say, everything's great. It's beyond my control. I'm going to have my coffee, whatever. Instead, we see examples like Epictetus actually adopting a child in need in order to try to take care of the child. And we see a lot of good things that Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, did. He was considered one of the 5 good emperors. And we also see examples such as Cato and later on the Stoic opposition, so-called, standing up to essentially tyranny in a sense. So throughout history, we see a lot of Stoics doing stuff and engaging themselves with the world. They're not just withdrawing and saying, it doesn't matter. So how do we reconcile this phrase, it's nothing to me, with how the Stoics actually behave, and as previous speakers have kind of already painted a great portrait of, what Stoicism actually is? So the thesis for my talk is that we should actually take this phrase a bit more literally, that there's some hidden Stoic theory inside of this phrase, it's nothing to me, that's being missed when you just read Epictetus's handbook or Enchiridion. And that by literally, I think it translates more to, instead of it's nothing to me, meaning I don't care or I will care less about it, it's more that it has nothing to do with what I really essentially am as a human being. And the answer to the question of what one really essentially is as a human being is prohoresis, which is the Greek word. It's hard to translate a little bit, but it's faculty of choice, I guess is one way to put it. Sometimes translated as the will or volition as well, although those may be a little bit questionable. So what I think this phrase, it's nothing to me, actually means is if somebody was actually trained by Epictetus and was in the Stoic school, they would know this theory. And so it's nothing to me wouldn't mean I don't care whatever. It would actually remind them of Epictetus's theory of selfhood, and then be a prompt for them to focus more on what actually matters in life and is under their complete control, which is this small aspect of your mind called your prohoresis. It is essentially your ability to say yes, no, or maybe to your first impressions about things. It's not all aspects of your mind. You can't control your initial reactions, your emotions, your automatic thoughts, your moods, physical sensations. None of those are under your complete control. But this one tiny part of your mind, this prohoresis, or faculty of choice, is. And I'm going to argue today that that there are at least more nuances or more connotations of a theory of self in this phrase than is obvious on its face. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to defend this notion to start out with. Secondly, I'm going to compare and contrast it with another philosophy of life that actually has a lot to say about selfhood, which is Buddhism, and see that there's one aspect of Buddhism given during the second sermon that the Buddha gave after his purported enlightenment, which actually resonates quite strongly and actually allows us to reframe this phrase, it's nothing to me, in a bit more palatable and less easily misinterpreted light. And finally, since this is a whole bunch of theory and stuff, I'm going to bring it home by trying to cover exactly why this matters and what we could do with it and how this phrase fits into Stoic practice overall. So let's start by taking a look at why we should think that we should take it's nothing to me more literally. So the first reason, I think, is that we have to keep in mind who wrote it down. So this is Arrian, was a student of Epictetus's, and through whom we have all of Epictetus's thoughts, essentially. Epictetus doesn't have any writings that survived. And so pretty much most, if not all of what we know, most of what we know about Epictetus comes through Arrian, who sat down and actually studied under Epictetus and then wrote two things, essentially, the Discourses and the Enchiridion or Handbook. And so the Enchiridion or Handbook, we know from the Neoplatonist Simplicius, that he wrote the handbook as a distillation of his discourses. And he actually dedicated it to a friend who was, quote unquote, an enthusiast or a real fan of Epictetus. And so that's why Arrian wrote it down. And so the Enchiridion is a distillation of longer works that are already written. And so I think because of this, there are things that can be easily missed if you just read the Enchiridion alone and don't take a look at Epictetus's works within the larger context of the Discourses, as well as Stoic theory as a whole. And so you could misinterpret a phrase such as "that's nothing to me" more easily if you don't keep in mind the whole. And so what specific things could we miss when interpreting the phrase "that's nothing to me"? Well, I think the big thing here is that throughout the Discourses, we see pretty strongly that Epictetus had a strong theory of selfhood, and that this plays a role in his way he taught Stoic practice. He literally thought that we, our essential selves, are our prohoresis, this faculty of choice, and we are not our first impressions about things, we are not our bodies or anything else like that. Instead, we fundamentally are our prohoresis. And this is a strong metaphysical claim that we see throughout the Discourses, but don't see in the Enchiridion. So if you read the first part of the Enchiridion and come across this phrase, "it's nothing to me," you could easily misinterpret it if you're not necessarily keeping in mind Epictetus's theory of selfhood. And just to show you that I'm not making this up, we have a lot of modern scholars who assert this. Modern Stoicism and Reason.io founder Greg Sadler has said this explicitly, that that Epictetus, by the time Epictetus is done with working with the prohoresis and elevating it above how it's been used in the past, it signifies the very core of a person, the self, if you like. And he's not the only one. Aldo Danucci, who is a professor of philosophy and logic, currently based in Brazil, and he also runs Viva Vox out of Brazil, which is a member of the Stoic Fellowship. He says in one of his works for Epictetus, prohoresis is what we really are. It's our essential selves. And here's Anthony Long saying that our essential selves are our volitions, which is how he interprets prohoresis. So this is not too controversial a point, that Epictetus really had a very strong theory of what we essentially are, who we are, what our selves are. And because it was so strong and apparent, I think this could feed into the phrase, "that's nothing to me." And that's a reason to think about it. But before I proceed, I also want to say that this is not a universal view. I think modern Stoicism's very own Christopher Gill, I've read some of his works, and I think he actually may demur, though he can clear this up another time, perhaps. But from what I've read, I think he says that we shouldn't take this literally, in that what he calls our psychophysical selves is what Epictetus really takes as ourselves. And so this isn't a universal view, and this weakens my position, and I do acknowledge that. But I do think it's pretty strong, especially in light of what we see from Epictetus himself. I mean, he has a lot of passages here, but here's one where it's just blatant. Epictetus says, "For you are neither flesh nor hair, but choice," which is the translator's choice for translating prohoresis here. So that is pretty blatant. You are prohoresis. So going with that and seeing how Epictetus really focused on a theory of self and had a coherent theory of self, I think that's one reason to maybe take "that's nothing to me" more literally. But in the Discourses, Book 4, there's also a very interesting but rare phrasing that I'd like to highlight, because I think this also lends some credence to the idea that we should take "that's nothing to me" more literally. So in Book 4, Chapter 1, Epictetus tells his students to purify your judgments so that nothing that is not your own may remain attached to you or become part of yourself. So this seems to be very akin to saying "that's nothing to me." You try to make your judgments to be the case that you don't take anything that isn't your own, externals, and that they don't remain attached to you, brought close to you, or becoming part of yourself, like literally taking it into your prohoresis. This is actually very reminiscent of the theory of oikiosis, or appropriation, or bringing into oneself. And I'm going to make some connections thanks to Christopher Gill's work later on to kind of show this a little more explicitly. But this is a very interesting phrasing here, that Epictetus is telling us to purify our judgments so that we don't take things that are not our own close to us, or make them literally part of ourselves. And what is ourself for Epictetus? Well, it's our prohoresis. And so we almost mistakenly identify with things when we fail in Epictetus's first area of training, the discipline of desire. And so this is a rare phrasing. And I think my arguments throughout today are relatively weak overall. And I do acknowledge that. But I do want to say that these things do exist, and that alone is reason for kind of thinking or taking "that's nothing to me" a little more literally. But that phrasing is also very interesting, because we see something very, very similar in the second sermon given by the Buddha after he was enlightened. And I wanted to compare and contrast this, because I think that this phrasing actually can make the phrase "that's nothing to me" a little less easily misinterpreted. So Epictetus and the Buddha would have actually agreed on the fundamental criteria for what makes something yourself. And I'm not going to read all of this. This is from the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses. But essentially what the Buddha is doing here is he's going over how he divides up a person's personhood, or a person's life. He divides it up to 5 things called the 5 aggregates, and he goes over them one by one. Their form, feeling, perception, choices, or I prefer the translation fabrications, and consciousness. I'm not going to go into all that right now, but essentially it's a person's physical and mental life overall. And he says each of them is not yourself, because if it were yourself, you would have complete control over it. So he literally says, if form, for instance, is your body, were yourself, you could compel the form. May my form be like this. May it not be like that. But we can't do that. We can't stop aging or anything like that. We can't grow wings on will. So therefore, it's not ourself. And I think Epictetus would actually agree with this. He would say, hey, we can't control things, and that's a strong criteria for saying that that's not ourselves. Furthermore, the Buddha actually also has a very similar way to respond to how to deal with things that are not your own. And he says, for each of these things, you tell yourself, this is not mine, I am not this, and this is not myself. And so that is how you respond to it. And I think this is actually quite similar to what Epictetus is asking us to do in Enchiridion 1.5 when he says that's nothing to me. But I think it fleshes it out a little more. So if we map on what we see in Enchiridion 1, the phrase "that's nothing to me," to what we saw in book 4 of the Discourses, purify your judgments so that nothing that is not your own may remain attached to you or become part of yourself, we kind of see the Buddha's phrasing map onto this quite well. Some things that are not your own, this is not mine. Things that remain attached to you, I am not this. And this is not myself, for things that become a part of yourself, which is in Epictetus's view, I think, is your prohairesis. So as a quick aside, I want to go and say that they wouldn't necessarily agree about everything. So Epictetus thinks that in the world of things and your own personal experience, which is represented by the orange circle here, all of that is beyond your control. That includes things like your reputation, what's happening around the world right now, news, but it also is about things that are a little closer to us, our bodies, but also parts of our mental life, even our initial reactions and thoughts, and what we would call feelings or emotions. Not all of them, but some things that we would call emotions, I would argue, are not under our direct, complete control. All of that is excluded in the orange circle, but there's a tiny bit of our minds which is under a complete control. And when we say to ourselves, that's nothing to me, what we're trying to do is remind ourselves to focus on this part that we can completely control, which is our prohairesis, our faculty of choice, our ability to say yes, no, maybe, I don't know, to our initial impressions about things. The Buddha would demur. Out of all the things, external and internal in the world, there's exactly nothing that is under your complete and total control. So I did want to just point that out, but it is kind of an aside here. But the main take home, I think, is that the Buddha's phrasing is very similar to that's nothing to me, and also less easily misinterpreted. So if we reappraise, which is the title of this talk, so we're finally getting there. If we reappraise that's nothing to me, I think it's a mistake to take it as meaning don't sweat the small stuff and it's all small stuff. Yeah, to quote a book. But because, at the end of the day, metastatic cancer and global poverty ain't small stuff, to be to be blunt. Now, there is probably some connotation of definitely putting things to the side here, but I think there's also a strong connotation of literally saying this isn't part of me, this isn't mine, and this isn't myself fundamentally. And I think that's what Epictetus may be getting at. And by phrasing it in the way that we see the Buddha phrase it, I think it's a little less easily misinterpreted. Instead of that's nothing to me means whatever, I don't care. It means this is not mine, I am not this, and this is not myself. And somebody who studied and trained in Epictetus's school would see this and know this, and they wouldn't necessarily interpret it as just saying, I don't care, I don't give a crap. And instead, actually, it would be more of a cue to have at hand in order to remind them that they should focus on the state of their prohairesis. So the first takeaway here, the first practical takeaway, I think, is that this takes the bite out of that's nothing to me. If you are new to Stoicism, you came and started reading the Enchiridion, there is a good chance that you may have seen this and some other things in the Enchiridion and be turned off by Stoicism. And I don't blame you, because it sounds repugnant on its face. Part of my goal here today is to show you that for understanding more Stoic theory and background, I think this misinterpretation becomes less probable, and that maybe if you've experienced this, you could take this as a lesson to, hey, maybe I should read more like John Sellers, Donald Robertson, and stuff like that in order to, and plenty of other people I didn't mention, just to not leave anybody out, so in order to understand the background for Stoicism a little bit more. I think I actually said in my Modern Stoicism interview that I recommend going with, don't go with primary sources first. And this is the reason. It's part of the theme of the talk. The second kind of take home here is to see how this fits in to Stoic practice overall. And here I am heavily indebted and heavily rely upon Modern Stoicism's own Christopher Gill's work, who makes a really interesting point that I really haven't seen in other places. So he equates Stoic, if I understand him correctly, he equates Epictetus's training regimen to the theory of oikiosis, or making your own. And we see this as a pretty hard to translate term. It comes from the same root, but it means like literally bringing into your household. And oikia is where we get economics from nowadays. But I guess it kind of really means appropriation in a positive sense. Appropriation nowadays does have some negative connotations, but appropriating or bringing into your own. And this is a process of literally claiming ownership as a mental step to things. And Christopher Gill points out that the first discipline of Epictetus, which is the discipline of desire, which is to train yourself to not desire at all, but to choose lightly things that are not in your complete control, while also, in Epictetus's phrasing, transferring your aversions from externals to internals, essentially, which essentially means not caring about the outcome, but caring about your reactions to the outcome. So that's the discipline of desire. And Christopher Gill makes the interesting point. He calls this personal appropriation, where the first phase and most important phase of Stoic training is to start out with what you take as good, which is a whole bunch of things. It can be, it's everything from your reputation to, your character is definitely important, your intelligence, your looks, your wealth, all these kinds of things. And the first phase of Stoic training is to constantly sort these things out into two buckets, which are externals, which are not yours or your own, and in the internals, which is actually not all the internals, because again, your initial reactions to things that I would call your mood, I wouldn't necessarily are under your complete control. But you focus on the very specific thing of the state of your prohairesis, which is you and all you really own in this world. And so Christopher Gill calls this a personal appropriation, personal oikiosis. You try to push out of things that you claim that you implicitly think you own and you think are part of yourself and what makes you you. It's not that. You put those to the side and you focus just on your prohairesis. I think Seneca has a great analogy that, when you focus on a horse, you just want to see how the horse runs. You don't throw a nice golden saddle at it and then all of a sudden say it's a great horse. All these externals are like golden saddles. It doesn't matter to what you are as a fundamental person. Instead, the only thing that really matters and what makes you you is your prohairesis and its state and the state of your prohairesis. So this is where "that's nothing to me" comes in. It serves as a way of sorting the wheat from the chaff, and the chaff is essentially the externals at the end of the day, which includes things like your body and even mood and stuff like that. And just focusing on the state of your own mind, a specific small portion of it that is under your complete control and is essentially you. But this all sounds kind of selfish so far, because you're still, you do you kind of stuff. You're just focusing on yourself. So how does this solve the problem I brought up at the beginning of interpreting Stoicism as a kind of selfish philosophy about just maintaining peace of mind? Well, this is where another important part of Stoic theory comes in. The state of our prohoresis, of our own minds, consists of two aspects that were brought up actually earlier. I believe John Sellers brought them up. One is that we are rational. We make sure we make correct judgments about all things in life as much as possible. We double check ourselves, but especially about our value judgments. And that's what the first discipline of Epictetus and personal appropriation kind of amounts to. But there's another second very important part of our minds, the state of our prohoresis, which is caring about other people. So when you focus on your prohoresis, you're not just trying to maintain
3
peace.
minutes.
Thank you. So you're not just trying to maintain peace of mind. That's only part of your prohoresis. You are also trying to care more about others, to expand your circles of caring from just yourself to family, friends, and everything. And this is what Christopher Gill calls social appropriation. So at the end of the day, saying that's nothing to me helps you put the stuff to the side that actually gets in the way of caring more about others. Epictetus gives a really great analogy to this. He was bringing up a Stoic paradox. I think it was the paradox. Stoic paradoxes are essentially things to get conversations going that go against the common beliefs. And one of them is that only the Stoic sage can love. And students got into arguments about love and friendship. And one of his students said, of course, I have friends. I could be friendly. Why can't anybody but a sage be friendly? And Epictetus says, well, you are friendly like puppies. And the student, you can imagine the student saying, yeah, totally like puppies. What could be more friendly, right? But Epictetus says, yeah, puppies are friendly as long as everything's going well. But maybe don't feed them for a little bit and then throw a piece of meat between them. Those friendly puppies are going to turn against each other like nobody's business. That's the kind of friendship that non-sages have, all of us who are non-sages. So there's no shame per se in having this, but it's an important point. And I think it's actually the real motivation of Stoicism, or the motivation of Stoicism that I would prefer to put forward, which is that we all have our meat, that these people and these relationships we claim to value and that people we claim to love, we love them as long as things go well. That is the definition, almost the definition of non-sagehood. And so that's a contingent caring. That's a contingent love. And I would argue that saying that's nothing to me puts the crap to the side that gets in the way of that, so that instead of making you care less about people, it makes you care a whole lot more. And with that, I will hang around for a little bit and answer Q&A stuff that I see in the comments, but also you're welcome to reach out to me on my website, greglopez.me/contact, if you want to engage in some dialogue about what I presented here today. So with that, that's my talk. Thank you.